But Chris, I am very pleased to be interviewing you in person. It's actually strange for me to be interviewing anyone in person because I never do that. But what we're going to be talking about, I'm here in the UK. We're going to be talking about what could be a very transformative moment, not just for British people, not just for the UK, but overall in the world. Because if Corbyn can win this general election, it will set a precedent that could be followed up by a Sanders victory, and who knows what else could go on in the world. After that, there's a resurgence of a social democratic movement, and I'm very excited to be talking to you about it. In your book, The British State, I think is very relevant right now. But I guess I wanted to start by asking you, do you think that despite the fact that the major media is saying that Corbyn doesn't have much of a chance, that he does, and on what basis? I mean, I know you're going to say he does, but on what basis do you think he has an opportunity to?
Well, partly, I mean, I think the polls have proved to be completely unreliable on this question. You know, in 2017, they were saying that he was going to be, 20 points below. He ended up, being 2 or 3 apart and doing incredibly well. And they just didn't begin to predict that. So, I mean, I actually think there's some kind of quite deep thing wrong with the polling system in Britain. I'm not sure, I'm not enough of an expert to know exactly what it is, but they clearly are unable to capture the political dynamic at the moment. So I think there's that. I think during an election, the candidates, the prime ministerial candidates, get way more coverage than they do at any other time.
Right.
And Jeremy is just, by any kind of, even if you just take the politics away for a moment, Jeremy's so way the best candidate. He comes across very well. People believe in him because he's telling the truth and because he's honest. So all that will kick in. Also, I think the big question is, can Labour make this an election that isn't mainly about Brexit? Because the whole Brexit thing has been the big problem for Labour. It's divided the country along a kind of, well, I hesitate to say it, but sort of a cultural division as opposed to a political one.
Yeah.
And it's kind of muddied the waters and confused the political picture. If we can get back to the issues that people really care about, the fundamental issues about inequality, about the NHS, about welfare, about the kind of rampant injustice of the whole kind of political and economic order here, then I think that can transform the situation. I don't think there's no question about it. That is what they're trying to do. And they started out with this sort of attack on the billionaires, which was brilliant because it polarised the situation. It made it clear that, this is an operation. Labour are actually going to go for some fundamental change, and they're not scared of saying that, which is a real break from the Labour of the last 30, 40 years, to be honest. So if all that can come through, I think he's got a very good chance. I mean, I'm not saying he'll have an overall majority, but he could well be forming a government come December the 13th, in my opinion.
Yeah. And do you think that if he were to get that government, that minority government put together, that I guess it seems to me that he would be in a much stronger position if the U.S. left got it together to get someone like Bernie Sanders elected. And I noticed that Sanders has picked up on Corbyn's anti-billionaire position, and that they've actually put Elizabeth Warren through the test, asking her what she thought of that. She's pro-billionaire now. On the record, pro-billionaire. But how important do you think that the cliche is that the UK has a special relationship with the United States? The way that I've always thought of that is they're unfortunately our lapdog and our worst atrocities like the Iraq War. But in this case, it could be a positive thing that the U.S. and the United Kingdom are closely aligned. So how important do you think it will be for Corbyn's government that the United States has someone like Bernie Sanders elected?
Well, first of all, in a minor key, I do agree with you. I think just even now, just the kind of level of kind of slight symbiotic relationship that's going on between Bernie and Jeremy is very, very good. And the way that Sanders picked up on the kind of class rhetoric that Labour has been beginning to adopt now is fantastically important, because class is the big question here. Right. Class is the big unspoken in British politics, and I guess in America as well. And it's like, if we can get into a situation where people are beginning to discuss this whole process, this whole election campaign in terms of class, that can make a massive difference, because it cuts through all the kind of, well, it obviously cuts through the question of Brexit, but also it kind of cuts through all the sort of, you know, the waffle really about spending plans and so on and so forth, which, you know, that we need to have some attention to that detail. But nevertheless, the real question is whether people feel as if this is a potential government, or this is a you know, a party that is really going to try and address the massive class inequality that exists in this country, in the US. So I think that's very important. It's great that Bernie, you know, that Bernie endorsed that move, that shift towards class, which is, you know, really hasn't happened for 40 years, and he's fantastic. So that's been great. I mean, obviously, if it did look as if Bernie was, even if he was, you know, looking as if he might be the Democratic candidate, that would be electrifying in Britain.
Yeah.
And it would create this sense of, you know, this isn't just a kind of national process, this is something which I absolutely think it is part of a much, much wider kind of popular rebellion that's going on around the world against the economic consensus that's dominated over the last 40 years. You know, you can see it in the street protests in Chile, in Iraq, in Algeria, in Tunisia, Sudan, you know, across parts of Latin America. This election's taking place at a moment when the neoliberal order is really suffering a crisis of legitimacy on a massive scale. And I think people feel, you know, in those countries, obviously, people feel as if it's just insupportable. We cannot carry on like this.
Right.
But I think there's a strong element of that here too, and I think sometimes the left underestimates the extent to which people feel as if, you know, we've got food banks, we've got people sleeping in the streets in large numbers, increasing every month. We've got a kind of level of abuse in the workplaces and casualisation and insecurity in the workplaces that is giving people mental health problems. Right. You know, at every level, the infrastructure in this country is breaking down. You know, the transport system's rubbish.
It's okay compared to the US.
Okay, all right. I don't mean to insult you. I mean, you know, fair enough. But I mean, people work on what they're used to, and there's absolutely no doubt that there's a massive decline.
Is the London Tube system worse than it was 5 years, 10 years ago?
The London Tube system is overcrowded, massively overcrowded, and super expensive. It's the most expensive in Europe. Right. So on those two fronts, it's very, very problematic, and a lot of the lines are constantly breaking down. So it's not great. I think the rail system, the national rail system, is a complete joke. I mean, it's falling apart. Right. No wonder that people, like, in their huge majority, support nationalisation of the railways, because these cowboys at Virgin and Great Western Trains and so forth, they have just been milking it, and it's obvious they've been taking the government subsidies, they've been making a huge profit on the sky high prices, and just taking the piss out of the passengers. So, you know, that's the general perception. You know, and I think that's working right across of society. You know, almost every official institution is in some sort of meltdown at the moment, and that's why people are saying we can't carry on like this, and that's why I think Corbyn can win.
It's a really interesting moment when I think about it in this way. That in 2016, Donald Trump in the United States won by claiming to be a billionaire.
Yeah.
You know, and by saying, I can do for America what I've done for my business. I can make us winners again. And now we've got a Democratic Party and a Labour Party. They're running against they're even being billionaires. And if some of the same people would vote for Sanders instead of Trump, people who flipped from Obama to Trump and then maybe they'll flip to Sanders, were to vote for him, they would be rejecting the delusion that they're all secretly like embarrassed millionaires or billionaires themselves, right? They'd be embracing a more egalitarian vision for the future. But it's a strange thing to think that it could come right on the heels of this. But I wonder what you make of that transition and how important it is, I guess, for people to abandon the idea that the billionaire class, that, you know, that the pie can only get, if the pie gets bigger than everyone, you know, wins, or the tide rises and all ships rise with it, or are we beginning to see cracks in that ideological foundation?
Yeah, I think we are. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, you know, look at the figures for the number of people in the US who kind of self-define as socialist, in however vague a term.
Right.
I mean, that is a new phenomenon, it seems to me, and you know, it has to be significant. And in a way, I sort of think, you know, I mean, this is the optimistic take, but the darkest day is just before the dawn.
Right.
And you know, we have got, I mean, in a way, Trump represents a kind of the most extreme version of a sort of hypercharged, extractivist, you know, off the leash neoliberal capitalism.
Right. I mean, he even said during the campaign that we should just take the oil from Iraq.
Yeah,
like we just steal it.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that was his campaign promise.
Yeah.
You know, usually that, you know, people try to deny that that's what the wars are about, and he was like saying, "Well, it wasn't about that enough." So it was truly shocking to me at the time when he said that. But I guess by expressing it directly, maybe we can overcome the reality of that.
Yeah, I mean, at one extent, he's like a cartoon version of kind of, you know, of what the capitalist system is. Although obviously it's contradictory, because he also did talk about, you know, jobs in the Rust Belt. And he also did talk about there being a problem with the foreign interventions.
Right.
So he's a tremendously
pro-torture, anti-intervention.
Yeah. So he's a tremendously contradictory figure.
Yeah, he is.
Who kind of, and I think in that sense you can see why you could have a situation where, following on from that, you get a kind of almost what seems to be a 180-degree reversal. But I think that the big contradiction that we're all facing, and not just in the US and Britain, but right around the world, is that in a way the very, very serious crisis of neoliberalism, of the neoliberal model of capitalism, is taking place at a time when the organised left is very, very weak.
Right.
You know, and that is, in a way, that is the sort of the paradox that we're trying to work through. So you've got a situation where, you know, the Corbyn project comes out of nowhere in a way, and the left sensibly kind of, you know, unites behind him, which is great, but from a very low level in terms of, or complicated. I mean, I don't want to overestimate it, because we have had a whole series of big demonstrations and protest movements in the last 18 or 20 years, but nevertheless, in terms of an actual socialist left, it's been a period where, you know, for all sorts of reasons, it's been relatively weak. So we're rapidly trying to put together a left that is kind of fit for purpose, in a situation where I think there's no question this is the biggest opportunity, not just in Britain or the United States, but across the world, that the left has had for generations. And that's the fundamental kind of problem that we're trying to we're having to deal with in very short order.
Yeah. Well, this makes me want to talk about your ideas about movement politics, and because if Corbyn gets elected, it's not like that's the end of the road by any means. I mean, we kind of all know this. We've seen what happened. This is a weird way to put it, but we've seen what's happened to Trump. The amount of establishment resistance to Trump, which I'm really just grateful for, right? But nonetheless, it's clearly the case that if someone like Bernie Sanders were to be elected, he would receive similar, if not worse, treatment than Trump. In the UK, a very similar thing is going to happen to Corbyn. He'll be in an even weaker position because he will not be most likely in the majority government. So, what you've been talking about, the need for the left to organize a movement to support Corbyn's agenda, and that would be a movement that takes to the streets, that works in an extra political way, or so I'm wondering how we can conceive of that movement when the movement politics we've seen for the last, say, 20, 30 years have been kind of something that's emerged hand in hand with the dismantling of the political left. It's come along at the same time that we've become weaker and weaker. We've more and more, invested hope into a kind of undifferentiated, unexplored mass. The movement will take care of it rather than this political project and this political party. So how do we conceive of a movement that's political, behind a political power?
Well, I mean, first of all, I've very much agreed what you're saying about, you know, the challenges posed by, challenges that would be posed to a Corbyn government. I think it's, you know, I don't think there's been enough discussion about that. I don't know about it in America, but I don't think there's been enough discussion here about the extent to which, if Corbyn were to get elected, there would be all sorts of different moves against him.
Yeah.
I mean, the last Labour government, the last radical Labour government in Britain in the 1970s faced, subversion and sabotage by the civil service, by the security services, by the Bank of England, by the IMF, by investment strikes. I mean, very, very turbulent times. And actually, if we're honest, and I think we have to be honest, that government was overcome by the combined forces of the establishment, and it ended up being a disaster. So, I think we do need to take these things very, very seriously, and we have to break and get away from the idea that, getting Jeremy Corbyn elected will be the end of the story. It will be the beginning of something. It will be a fantastic achievement, but, and maybe for a while it will be, like in 1974 when the Wilson government got elected. For the first 6 months, it was able to pursue quite a radical agenda, and it was good. That may happen, but nevertheless, there is no way that in an establishment so dedicated and committed to the sort of neoliberal operation that they're just going to let this stuff go through.
Yeah.
So there will be that level of resistance. I think that's absolutely unquestionable. And how do we resist it? I mean, it's a complicated. Or how do we start thinking about how to push it back? It's a complicated question. But I do think that, first of all, over the last 20 years, the movement in Britain, certainly, that has been the anti-war movement, the pro-Palestine movement, anti-austerity movements, big protests and big organisation that has been very important in actually forging Corbynism itself, funnily enough. I mean, there's no question that Jeremy wouldn't be where he is if it wasn't for the fact that he was so engaged and so important for the anti-war movement and for the, and someone who's always supported strikes.
In 2002 or
2003, and then after, yeah. I mean, that's been very important. So that is a tradition of politics that I think is very important, and we need to draw on that and try and think about how we can expand that and develop it. And I think there's always the danger that politics, or what people perceive as politics, is reduced to what goes on in Parliament. But actually, this isn't, if you think about it, this isn't really the tradition of the socialist left. The socialist left, or certainly it's not the only tradition of the socialist left. The socialist left, if you go back to to its high points in Britain and elsewhere, the Chartists, the general strike, the big movements in the 1970s and so forth. And if you look internationally at the great revolutionary movements, the socialist left has always seen politics as being something which is participatory, which is connected to struggle, which is connected to street mobilisation, which is connected to the unions.
Right.
And, in the big revolutionary crises in the 20th century, what you've seen emerging has been actual kind of institutional forms of kind of workers' councils or participatory assemblies of different kinds that have actually come together out of the movements and connected to the movements, that have created a whole different tradition. And I think we've got to get back to understanding that, and we've got to have a view that if Jeremy gets elected, it would be a real opening, but it would be an opening that we'd have to be very well organised to go through. And that means, I think we have to, we draw on the best of the recent traditions and say, get the movements talking to the unions and saying, okay, we're going to have to join the dots here. We're going to have to say, the anti-war movement, the anti-austerity movement, the pro-Palestine movement, the various different, the housing campaigns. We're going to have to find some way to work together and to work with and support and defend a Corbyn government. That's just what we're going to have to do.
Right.
And if that means calling some sort of popular assembly, I'm not talking about a constituent assembly, I'm talking about an assembly of the movements. And let's face it, that's not something that's completely kind of alien. That's happened recently. If we have to call an assembly of the movements as a way of saying, we're going to work together to defend a Corbyn government, then that's what we'll do. And I really think that is important. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I think that a lot of people understand the necessity of it, and I think people are up for it.
Well, what comes to mind for me is not about British politics, but about French politics, because I was just there, right? And in '68, well, so my real question is, to what extent does Corbyn have the support of labor unions in the UK. But the way to get to that is in '68 in Paris, the major French unions, the CGT, were not helpful in creating the space to get people mobilized for a new kind of government or new society. And I wonder if we can rely on the forces that already exist in the UK to really rally and fight for a Corbyn victory and what the Corbyn victory is leading to is some sort of working class change for society. So I would say revolution, but Corbyn at least would say something else. But just to get the reformist policies of Corbyn through, we'll need real fighting spirit. Can we rely on the trade union movement in the United Kingdom for that kind of support?
Well, in my understanding of British labour movement history, this is the first time that the bulk of the trade unions have actually backed a left-wing leader of the Labour Party.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, that is a substantial step forward. I mean, normally in political terms, historically in political terms, the unions have tended to be on the kind of centre or right of the spectrum of Labour.
Right.
But then we've never had a situation where an actual the leader of the Labour Party is a left-winger. Right. So, I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. So that's been a step forward. And actually, without union support, I don't think Jeremy would have got as far as he's got already. So that's positive. Having said that, we're also in a situation of a relatively passive kind of trade union movement at the moment. You know, we're still at the situation where we've got the lowest level of strike numbers for decades, and that is a problem. And I think the unions are finding it quite hard to know how to deal with that situation. So those things would kick in as well. There's a level of passivity in the unions. Having said that, though, it's also true that just in the last few months, there's been signs of an upsurge in trade union struggle. We've had a brilliant result from the postal workers who are fighting against kind of sort of Uber, well, basically the breakup of the post service. And they've had a 97% yes vote on a huge turnout for their ballot. 78% turnout, 97% yes vote. I mean, that's an incredible thing. Yeah. Unheard of, actually. Is probably you'd have to go back decades to get to that kind of result. You've had the UCU, the university lecturers, who just voted for quite widespread action. You've got Southwest Trains, who are now going to be on strike for quite a long period. And I think, in a way, the government's made it very, very hard, almost impossible, to get yes votes. So when unions get yes votes, they're no longer interested in one day here, one day there. Southwest Trains is coming out for 27 days in a row in the run-up to Christmas, which is a bit of a breakthrough here. Now, I think this is interesting because it shows that the whole Corbyn project is not just, it's not sort of its own unique thing. It expresses a much wider sense of outrage and anger that people feel, and it's beginning to spill over that feeling into self-activity amongst people, and that's incredibly important. So if we could have a situation where, I don't want to say anything that is going to make anyone feel, this isn't the sort of official Labour position, but if we could have a situation where we had a Labour government and we had lots of trade unionists who were prepared to go out in the streets for fight for their rights, that would be a very potent situation. Right. And I think everyone would feel really that we're much more likely to get significant change by that combination.
When do you think it's going to be most important for working class people who want to see this agenda go through, to hit the streets and start to organize to support Jeremy? Before or after the election? Because the danger of getting the streets early is you can alienate people. Right? When you can start to fight before a fight's begun. But on the other hand, you want to show support and the power of the Corbyn movement. So when should we start to organize for this?
Well, I think you have to be very concrete about these things. At the moment, the two key things, the main thing is, I think, the industrial action. I mean, if we do have these strikes taking place, I think that will give people a lot of confidence that,
Yeah, and it won't be seen as something just political.
Yeah, exactly.
A fight for people's...
Yeah. Yeah.
rights.
And I have a lot of confidence that, you know, that the leadership will at some level endorse the strikes as well, and so that would be good. That would be a very, very solid start. There's also in a more minor but still not unimportant register the demonstrations against NATO and the Trump visit, which is happening 10 days before the election. So Donald Trump's coming over, will be shaking hands with Boris Johnson in Buckingham Palace with the Queen. Seems to me to be that is a good moment for people to be taking a bit of time off going out on the knocker and canvassing to get out on the streets, because then we can have a big, you know, Britain and London has a very good tradition of mobilising against Donald Trump. Donald Trump is hated in this country, overwhelmingly, sorry.
Well, don't be, I'm fine with that.
No, I know.
You're right to hate
Donald
Trump.
I know. And you know, and obviously
the only person I hate more is George W. Bush. But anyway.
Fair enough. But no, I mean, there's a great deal of anxiety that, you know, Donald Trump and Boris are going to make some deal over the NHS, that the trade deals that they're going to work on together, if Boris was to win, if Johnson was to win, would be disastrous at all sorts of different levels. So this is a very good opportunity for a show of strength. Right. And December the 3rd, you know, we're going to be calling for the biggest possible protests against Trump and against NATO as well, because foreign policy is important to people. It's dear to the hearts of people on the British left, and I think that's important as well. So I'd say those two things in the election campaign. Obviously, most activist energy is going to be taken up rightly with getting the vote out, but let's have full support and solidarity with the strikes, and let's have a big turnout when Donald Trump comes over in December, and then we'll be in a good position, and then we can assess the situation, you know, depending on what happens in the election after that. But at least we'll be in a position where, you know, the idea of extra-parliamentary activity, the idea of self-activity and people getting organised and doing things themselves is kind of on the table, and that seems to me to be crucial.
How much danger is there around the NHS right now, really? And is the perception in the British public that such that people are perceiving that danger, and will that help Corbyn get elected?
I think there's a massive concern and anxiety about what's happening to the NHS. I mean, partly because everyone, you know, the vast majority of British people actually use the NHS, and they know in practice that it's been in sharp decline just in the last few years, really. Right.
Where we have a very good book about the NHS called How to Dismantle the NHS.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's a very good book. It's now been kind of leaked and exposed that there's been secret meetings between people from the US administration and people from the British government about what happens to the NHS post a Johnson-led Brexit. Wow. And I think that's very, very scary. And I think people are very worried that there's going to be a kind of, a fast track to privatisation. There's going to be all sorts of deals made with US farms. No, it's very good. It's very good. And so when Trump comes, I mean, one of the things we're going to do is we've got the NHS campaigners are going to be out on the street saying NHS not for sale. And I think that's very important, because I think that's an important component of the election campaign. But also, you know, it is. So, yeah, I mean, the NHS is kind of absolutely totemic. It's the central kind of symbol of the post-Second World War order in Britain, which is which obviously was the Attlee government brought in some serious reforms and did shift things in the direction of, you know, working people, and the NHS has been the bedrock of that. So for that to be under challenge by a Johnson government at a time when, you know, they're talking about a kind of an Atlanticist Brexit, I think is very, very damaging for the Tories, and rightly so. And I think we need to make the most of that we possibly can.
That would be something to organise around before the election to help Corbyn get elected. That wouldn't seem just political, but would seem like it's in the interest of the British public.
Absolutely.
To get up in arms about this.
Yeah.
Almost everyone loves the NHS, or at least they may not love being sick, but they love having the ability to get to their health care.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So my final question here is about Jeremy Corbyn. You know Jeremy, at least somewhat, and I'm wondering if you know how he's feeling or how confident he is about the upcoming election, and do you feel that he has a good insight into what his position is right now?
Well, I mean, I guess that he's feeling pretty buoyed up, to be honest, because the first week of the campaign has gone pretty well for Labour. and it's gone very badly for the Tories. There's absolutely no question about that. I mean, the Tories obviously weren't ready for the campaign, even though they did actually push the election themselves. Yeah. I don't know how that happened, but you know, and when the politicians are under the added and extra scrutiny that you get during an election, that exposes them. And so you have these situations where, you know, you have more of the cabinet on the media, and their every word is being observed. And you know, there were a series of absolute disasters for the Tories last week, which including most obviously the comments by Jacob Rees-Mogg, where he said that the people who died in Grenfell, in the Grenfell disaster, lacked common sense, which absolutely exposes the kind of, you know, the contempt, the elitism, the patrician sort of privilege that is so embodied in the Tories. And that's, you know, that's disastrous. I mean, it was a really bad thing to do, but the worst thing about it from the point of view of the Tories is it really confirms some pre-existing kind of feelings about the Tories, that they are all ultra-privileged Etonians who really, really can't stand ordinary people.
Background on that comment that he made?
Yeah.
I mean, tell me if I'm misremembering, because I may be misremembering. But was there a reason why? Was the idea that people stayed in the buildings longer than they might have, or they were assured that they should stay, or something like that? Why would they say that they lacked common sense? What was he even talking about when he said they lacked common sense?
Well, basically, there is a system in place at the moment in tower blocks, and I live in a tower block, where if there's a fire, you're told to stay in your flat because the flats are all self-contained and they've got fire breaches in the building. So that's kind of sensible. The problem with it was not that it was lacked common sense to go along with these. The problem with it was, in that particular block, it had cladding on the outside of the block that was had been put in on the cheap and that wasn't fireproof. Right. So that meant what was basically a sensible position, a sensible instruction or advice, was undermined, not by a lack of common sense, but precisely by the reduction in the level of regulation introduced by Jacob Rees-Mogg's government. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, it was a level of, you know, of criminal neglect on their part that made those instructions invalid, if they were invalid. I mean, who knows? It might have been even worse if people had done. I mean, I don't know enough about it. But anyway, that's where that thing came from. Even the media, which has been painfully anti-Corbyn, in my opinion, over the last few years. Even the media was critical of Jacob Rees-Mogg, because one thing they did is they showed some footage from a camera phone on that terrible night where someone did try and get out of their flat, and they opened the door and the corridor was just completely covered in smoke. Right. So, I mean, you know, actually it probably wouldn't have been, they might, you know, and this is someone who did get out as well, eventually. So, you know, who knows really? But anyway, the point about it is that this was a comment made in ignorance, made in the most appallingly sort of offhand and casual way, and it was an attempt to, I mean, almost unbelievably, it was an attempt to blame the victims of the Grenfell disaster for their own deaths. I mean, how much more of a condemnation can you get of a politician or a political order than that, really? You know, and Grenfell is the embodiment of the disasters caused by deregulation. You know, who's not sympathetic with the people in Grenfell? I mean, it's incredibly out of touch apart from it. Well, one aspect of this is of Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments is that they came off the back of the first part of the Grenfell inquiry, which focused a lot of its kind of criticisms against the firefighters, unbelievably, really. And, you know, there were, I mean, I'm not saying that there weren't issues around the firefighters, but as they themselves said, you know, the fire service in London has been cut to the bone by this government. So, you know, their ability to be able to monitor these situations and know how to respond to them has been massively compromised by the cuts. So to do that was outrageous. But, you know, in a way, what Jacob Rees-Mogg was doing, he was building on that to try and say that it was the firefighters' fault, because the firefighters continued to support what was the official line that has been agreed by all the authorities, that people should stay in their flats. and the argument is they pushed that that advice. They kept stuck with that advice too long. Well, I mean, I don't know, but this is also part of the agenda that rees-mogg was promoting. It wasn't just about, almost instinctively. I'm not saying he went in there with a political agenda. Instinctively, these people are, blame the victims, and if you don't get away with blaming the victims, blame the public services. That's what they do.
So, okay, Tom Watson resigned from the Labour Party. Is this a good sign for Corbyn? And does it mean the left wing of Labour is having its moment, or what does it mean? Because I actually really don't know.
Yeah.
In the US.
Well, I mean, Tom Watson is, or was, well, I suppose still is in a way, one of the main organisers of the opposition to Corbyn in the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Right.
Actually was the main organiser. And, he has been doing his best over the last period, over the last 4 years, to try and find ways to isolate, marginalise, demonise Jeremy Corbyn, and to create a kind of body within the Parliamentary Labour Party that can force him out. So, it has to be said that on any kind of objective reading of the situation, for him to want to resign is a good thing. Yeah. I mean, it's a good thing for the left, because it means that, one obstacle towards increasing the influence of the left in the Parliamentary Labour Party is gone. So yeah, I think it is a good thing. I think he probably genuinely, I mean, I don't know, but I think he probably genuinely did it for personal reasons, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing may well have been chosen to kind of destabilise the election campaign, or weaken the election campaign. But in general, I think I actually do.
Does it weaken it though?
I think in the short term, it was the kind of something the media could say. Oh, look, Labour's disunited and disorganised, and look, the deputy leader's going, and all this sort of thing. But I think you're right. In general, it frees up. It's one shift a bit towards the left. There's still a mountain to climb in the Parliamentary Labour Party, though. Be under no illusions, the vast majority of the MPs are not with Corbyn's, radical political agenda, and that is a big problem. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the way in which the British establishment and the British state kind of has a kind of informal alliance with the right wing in Labour, and they use each other to try and weaken Corbyn, and that's going to continue. Especially if he's got a minority government, there'll be massive pressure from the Lib Dems, probably even from the SNP, certainly from the kind of independent MPs, and from the Labour right, say, okay, we need to have a coalition, but Jeremy's too. Yeah, they'll say he's too divisive a character. They'll say he's too kind of. He's too left-wing, you can't have a unity around him, and all that stuff will happen, I think, very quickly. I mean, unless he does really, really well, in which case the moves against him will be delayed. But I think there'll be a huge amount, especially as the election's taking place just before Christmas, so there's going to be this mad period over Christmas. So I think that will all be going on, and the way the state operates and the way that the elites operate will be, they know well that they've got lots of friends in the Parliamentary Labour Party, or lots of people who share their discomfort with Corbyn, and so there'll be a kind of internal battle going on very, very quickly after the election result, in my opinion.
Well, if Jeremy wins the election, if you get your minority government, I think it's very important that he reads your book.
Okay, I'll tell him.
Tell him that I said so.
I will.
Well, it was great talking to you.
Thanks a lot, Doug.
Being in London.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. This is my new book, The British State: A Warning. I think it's putting an argument that the left needs to take seriously the kind of challenges that a Corbyn government would face if it gets elected, which I very much hope it will do, on December the 12th. My argument is that will just be the start, that there will be all sorts of attempts to sabotage and undermine a Labour government, and that we need to start thinking about what that means now, which is why I'd say read it.